You're standing in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no roads, no vending machine 3 hallways down that you've been passively thinking about for the last 2 hours. It's roughly 50,000 BC, somewhere on the African savanna, and you haven't eaten in 3 days. Not, I forgot to have lunch 3 days. Not, I'm doing intermittent fasting 3 days. 3 days of actual nothing, where the last thing that went into your body was a handful of bitter roots you found near a dried up riverbed, and you're not even sure they were safe. Your legs are heavy. Your head is doing that thing where thoughts arrive slow and half-formed, like a radio station losing signal. Your mouth stopped producing saliva sometime yesterday. And somewhere behind you, the rest of your group is in exactly the same condition, watching you, waiting to see what you're going to do next. This was not a rare catastrophe for early humans. This was Tuesday. We have this image of prehistoric life as a kind of rugged outdoor adventure. Hunt the mammoth, eat the mammoth, sit around the fire, repeat. But the fossil and archaeological record tells a much less cinematic story. Early Homo sapiens, and the species that came before them, lived in a world where food was seasonal, unpredictable, and constantly competed for by every other creature that also needed to eat. Droughts wiped out plant sources overnight. Animals migrated or disappeared. Rivers dried up. What looked like a reliable territory could become a dead zone in a matter of weeks. Researchers studying isotopic data from ancient bones have found clear evidence of repeated nutritional stress in early human populations. The physical signatures of starvation written directly into the skeleton. This wasn't occasional, it was structural. Hunger was baked into the deal. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the question of what ancient humans did when they couldn't find food isn't just a survival story. It's the origin story of almost everything that makes us human. The decisions they made under those conditions, the cognitive leaps, the social arrangements, the innovations born from desperation, those are the things that shaped our biology, our behavior, and our brains in ways that are still running in the background of everything you do today. The strategies they developed weren't just clever. They were, in many cases, the direct ancestors of agriculture, of trade, of language, of cooperation itself. All of it started with an empty stomach and the question of what happens next. So, what did happen next? Here's the uncomfortable biological truth that nobody puts in the history books. Starvation didn't just threaten early humans, it built them. When the human body goes without food for more than 24 hours, something remarkable starts happening beneath the surface. The liver burns through its glycogen reserves, insulin drops, and the body flips a metabolic switch, shifting from burning glucose to burning fat, producing ketones that cross the blood-brain barrier and fuel the brain directly. For a brief window, somewhere around day 2 or 3 of fasting, cognitive function doesn't collapse the way you'd expect. It sharpens. Focus narrows, pattern recognition improves. The brain, suddenly aware that survival is on the line, stops wasting resources on background noise and starts running lean and precise. This is not a coincidence. This is evolution's answer to a question it kept getting asked over and over again for hundreds of thousands of years. How do you keep the brain functional long enough to solve the problem of finding food when there is no food? The answer was to wire hunger directly into heightened mental performance, at least temporarily, at least long enough to matter. And it did matter, enormously. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer cognition have found that the decision-making required during food scarcity is some of the most cognitively demanding work a human brain can perform. You're not just hungry, you're running a continuous, real-time calculation across dozens of variables. Where did we see tracks last? Which direction is the wind? How far can we travel before we burn more calories than we find? Who in the group is strong enough to cover that distance, and who isn't? What's the fallback if this direction fails? These are not simple problems. They require memory, spatial reasoning, probabilistic thinking, and social coordination all running simultaneously in a brain that is operating on empty. The humans who did this well survived. The ones who couldn't, didn't. And that selection pressure, repeated across thousands of generations, almost certainly shaped the cognitive architecture we're all running on today. The human brain is disproportionately large relative to our body size compared to almost any other animal on Earth. We've long asked why. Hunting pressure, social complexity, and language all get credited, but starvation as a cognitive crucible, as the environment that kept demanding more from a brain that had to keep rising to meet it, that piece of the story doesn't get nearly enough attention. Your brain at its sharpest, that feeling when everything clicks and you're focused and precise and unusually clear, might be an echo of exactly this, the ancient emergency mode that kept your ancestors alive long enough to become your ancestors. So what did they actually do? When the calculation ran out of good options and the group was still hungry, what happened next? The answer is stranger, more creative, and more desperate than most people imagine. The first move was almost always expanding the definition of food. Modern humans are remarkably picky eaters by prehistoric standards. We have categories, things that count as food and things that don't. Early humans, under starvation pressure, had no such luxury. Archaeologists have found evidence of ancient populations consuming things that, under normal circumstances, they would have ignored entirely. Bark, certain mosses, the marrow scraped from bones that had already been picked completely clean, then cracked open and boiled to extract every remaining calorie. Insects, which are extraordinarily calorie-dense and available in virtually every environment on Earth, appear to have been a reliable fallback across multiple ancient populations on multiple continents. Not a delicacy, an emergency protocol. There's also compelling evidence that early humans ate things that were genuinely dangerous. Certain plants that are toxic in large quantities, but survivable in small ones. Animals that carried parasites or required specific preparation to be safe. The knowledge of how to process these borderline foods, which plants needed to be boiled, which parts of which animals to avoid, was itself a survival technology, accumulated through brutal trial and error across generations. Someone figured out that this root is edible if you soak it for a day. Someone else figured out the hard way that it isn't if you don't. The ones who remembered and communicated that distinction passed something forward that was worth more than almost any physical tool. Then there was movement. When local resources collapsed, groups moved. Sometimes short distances following animal migrations or seasonal plant cycles. Sometimes extraordinary distances that reshaped the human map of the world. Several major waves of human migration out of Africa are now believed to have been driven at least partly by food stress. Populations pushed outward not by curiosity, but by hunger, crossing landscapes and eventually continents because staying meant dying. And there was slowing down, deliberately, strategically. Groups would reduce physical activity to an absolute minimum, conserving calories with the same intentionality that a phone conserves battery in low power mode. They rested more. They moved less. They waited. It sounds passive. It was anything but. Knowing when not to act, when to hold still and let the body run on reserves rather than burning energy on a search that might return nothing, that is a form of intelligence that kept entire bloodlines alive. Here's the part of the story that almost never gets told. Hunger didn't just threaten early human groups, it organized them. When food becomes scarce, the social dynamics of a group don't simplify. They get dramatically more complex. And the way a group navigated that complexity, who got fed first, who went without, who made the call on when to move and when to stay, determined not just individual survival, but whether the group itself held together at all. Because a fractured group in a food-scarce environment wasn't just socially uncomfortable, it was a death sentence. Isolated individuals don't survive what cooperative groups can. The math is brutal and unambiguous. So early humans, under starvation pressure, developed something that looks, from a distance, remarkably like economics. Food sharing in hunter-gatherer societies is one of the most studied phenomena in anthropological research, and the findings consistently point in the same direction. Sharing wasn't charity, it was insurance. When a hunter brought back meat, distributing it widely across the group wasn't generosity in the modern sentimental sense. It was an investment in a system of reciprocal obligation. You share with me today when I have nothing. I share with you next week when the situation reverses. Anthropologists call this reciprocal altruism. But stripped of the academic language, it's something simpler and more recognizable. It's the oldest social contract in human history. I've got you now, you've got me later. The groups that formalized the system, that developed norms around sharing, that punished hoarding and rewarded contribution, those groups survived famines that wiped out groups operating on pure individual self-interest. The cooperative model wasn't idealism. It was the superior survival strategy, and natural selection favored the psychological traits that made it work: empathy, reciprocity, a deep sensitivity to fairness. The outrage you feel when someone cuts in line or takes more than their share, that is not a modern social nicety. That is an ancient alarm system built by hunger, calibrated over thousands of generations of resource scarcity. Hunger also drove the earliest forms of what we might recognize as leadership. Someone had to make the call. Move now or wait. Split the group or hold together. Try the Eastern Valley or push toward the mountains. The individuals whose judgment proved consistently sound in these moments accumulated something that functioned exactly like social capital. Trust that translated into influence, that translated into the group following their decisions when the stakes were highest. Not kings, not chiefs yet, but the earliest prototype of the idea that some people's judgment is worth deferring to when everything is on the line. Starvation didn't just feed human cooperation. In a very real sense, it invented it. Here's what's strange about all of this. None of it actually ended. We built grocery stores, we developed agriculture, we invented refrigeration and supply chains, and the kind of global food distribution infrastructure that means a person in Ohio can eat a mango in January without thinking twice about it. By every measurable standard, the food scarcity problem that defined human existence for hundreds of thousands of years has been, for most people in the developed world, effectively solved. And yet the systems that scarcity built are still running inside you right now, humming along in the background like software written for a world that no longer exists. That metabolic switch that sharpens your brain under fasting conditions, still there. The deep psychological discomfort you feel when you skip a meal, that anxiety that arrives around hour 6 of not eating that feels disproportionate to the actual situation, that's not weakness. That's a nervous system that was calibrated for an environment where 6 hours without food was a warning sign worth taking seriously. The intense pleasure response your brain produces when you eat something high in fat and sugar, the reason a slice of pizza hits differently than a handful of spinach, that's reward circuitry built by ancestors for whom calorie-dense food was rare, precious, and worth pursuing at significant cost. The social wiring runs just as deep. The discomfort you feel watching someone go without, the instinct to offer food to someone in your home almost immediately after they arrive. The way sharing a meal creates a sense of connection and trust that a phone call or an email simply doesn't replicate. These are not cultural accidents. They are the direct descendants of the social technologies that kept small groups of hungry humans alive on a savanna 50,000 years ago. Even your relationship with uncertainty has roots here. The anxiety of not knowing where the next good thing is coming from, whether it's food or money or security, activates the same ancient circuitry that fired when the hunting territory went dry and the group had to make hard decisions with incomplete information. The emotional texture of financial stress and prehistoric starvation are not as different as we'd like to think. Same system, different inputs. This is what makes the story of ancient hunger more than a history lesson. Every mechanism they developed to survive, biological, cognitive, social, is still inside you. Starvation protocols are still loaded. You just haven't needed them lately. But they're there, waiting, exactly as your ancestors left them.